Welcome to Integrating Video Games into K through 12 Classrooms. I'm Dr. Robert Moore. Many of you may know me from teacher and history classes here at Georgia Highlands. Before I pursued my PhD and got this job, I spent a couple years. Actually, I've graduated from West Georgia 3 times now, but my final time there was in the EDS program in Media Instructional Technology, where I learned a good bit about incorporating new technologies in the classroom, specifically video games. So I'm going to be talking to you, the future K through 12 educators here in Georgia, about how you can take video games and reach your students with something fun it turns out productive and educational. And as you see there, you're playing, right? You're kidding. Of course not. There's a lot of fun and creative things you can do with video games that will teach real life lessons, that will reinforce what your students need to learn in your classes. Video games today are so complex, the storytelling, the problem solving, that there's just so much in there that you can pull out, bring into your classroom, and reach your students in creative ways that hopefully will grab their interest and have them further invest in the educational process. Adding new technologies and tools to classroom culture. Now, the classroom culture now, for you, even if you have students using technology and devices, probably doesn't include Mario or characters from World of Warcraft. So you're going to have to change not just your way of thinking, but your students as well if you're going to be integrating video games. Uh, Good news is the students are used to the technologies. They live in a world that to them has never been without the internet, laptops, or handheld devices like cell phones or tablets. If you think about it, teenagers and younger, I mean, they can't even wrap their heads around some of us living at a time where the internet either didn't exist or at least wasn't in so many households. I mean, I still remember the AOL free trial CDs that everybody would get left and right, So, I mean, a lot of kids now, that would just be a relic. I mean, a CD would be a relic, much less AOL or a free trial to have the internet for the first time in your home, because they're just so used to the internet. You go anywhere, there's wireless, or most anywhere at least. So, I mean, you're reaching students with something and some things that they're very used to, that's very much just ingrained in their lives. Uh, Video games are a permanent part of our culture. Uh, I'm 34, and there's a few people here that are my age or a little older, perhaps. Not to be nosing into that, but you may remember Atari in the late 70s, early 80s. They were a major player with their video game systems, but by the mid 80s, the video game business just crashed. About died off for good. But then Nintendo came in with the original NES at the right time, saved it, made it stronger than ever, and kind of built this whole video game culture that we have today. But for our kids, I mean, they came along after Atari and even after NES and Super Nintendo and PlayStation and all that. I mean, to them, video games are just, an ever present thing. Allegories and scenarios are a key part of gaming and learning. Uh, there's allegories and scenarios you can pull out of most any kind of game to teach, and that's the way people have been teaching for years. I mean, look at literature, look at great films, look at most religions. You have these allegories, these parables, these fables, these things that will liken something to something else, just to instruct, to teach, to let us understand ourselves a little better and let us understand the world we're in a little better. Tying it all together, teaching students with video games equals reaching them on their level and reaching them with something they're used to, something that's normal, something that is normal anywhere probably but your classroom. But you can change that. You can change the classroom culture if you execute this correctly. Okay, Video games cover a wide range of topics. Got a little graph here with some popular titles. Zoo Tycoon's a favorite of mine. You can get a free download of that if you want to show your students it for a few days or a week. Within the game, you're running a zoo, and you got to keep in mind the numbers. You got to keep in mind the economics and the math because you're running a business, you're running a profit making enterprise, and you want customers in, you want them happy. And if you get too many giraffes and you lose all your money, people are going to quit coming, and the bank's going to foreclose on your zoo, and you can't play anymore and you can't have fun with it. There's also, I mean, you can teach science and nature to kids with this as well, because, I mean, with those giraffes, and when you're building their habitat, you're going to want the right kind of grass, the right kind of trees, the right amount of water based on where the giraffes are from and what the tundra is like, where they would be from in the world. So, I mean, there's a lot of lessons there. There's some science and some geography too. I list Madden 17, which is my personal favorite. Um, that one may seem a little unusual, but if you think about it, there's so many stats. You could teach math. You could build some real life math problems. If you have students that like the NFL, that pull for the Falcons and watch every Sunday with their family or friends, or they do fantasy football or whatever. I mean, if they have some level of interest in football, I feel like there's a lot you could do here. And you could even teach geography. Within the game, you have real cities in America and even the world. I mean, if you play long enough, you could take a team and relocate them, like the Rams moved from St. Louis to LA last year. I mean, you could take, I don't know, the Cleveland Browns or the Jacksonville Jaguars, and you could put them in London, or you put them in Mexico City or Toronto, and there's benefits and downsides based on, the economy in those places or the population or how well they presumably would know football. I mean, there's some lessons you could teach kids. I list the Call of Duty series here because, I mean, you could teach geography with the maps and the places in the world in those games, and social studies with some of the conflicts. Uh, this is one I would tread carefully with based on your stakeholders and where you work and sort of the culture around there, because, I mean, it is a game about, carrying around a gun. So, again, I would tread lightly with that one. But I mean, I'm just using an example by listing it of something popular, something your kids would know about that you could use in the classroom. RPGs like World of Warcraft, and there's some that are more realistic than World of Warcraft. I just wanted to list one that I imagine you've all, for the most part, have heard of. But there's math and scenarios in there that you could use. I even list social studies for something like Warcraft, even though it's obviously fantasy and fictitious. You could say, the idea of a bard, here's where it's from, or this weapon, here's the time and place it was designed, the real thing that this is based on. So, I mean, I think you could get creative and fun and teach too, and really reach your students in some creative ways that will be memorable to them. Challenges and limitations. Not all students have access to the same games and technologies. I have a PlayStation 4, for example. That's what I play Madden on. But if I brought it in and only 2 out of 30 students also had a PlayStation 4, they're not going to be used to it. They're not going to be used to controller. They may complain that I didn't bring an Xbox instead. So, I mean, those are little things you got to keep in mind when you're dealing with your students. Uh, Not all students care about video games. I feel like growing up, my age range, us so-called millennials, there's this idea that the video games and the Nintendo and the Nickelodeon and all the cable channels were kind of like our babysitters in a way, and that's just was a teenage thing and a preteen thing. Well, now a lot of us in our 30s are statistically more likely to be gamers than a lot of teens, for one thing. And also, I mean, just even as kids, not everybody played video games. There were always those kids that just didn't care about them for whatever reason, or maybe they didn't have access financially to them, or I grew up in a very conservative place. Actually, I grew up in Armurchie, which is in the same county as the original Floyd site for Georgia Highlands. But I grew up with kids that didn't have TVs for religious reasons. So I mean, not everybody's going to have video games or care about video games. So I keep putting over how you can reach students, how many you can reach, but just be in mind that it's not going to be 100% necessarily. Finally, for this slide, not all students have devices they can bring to school, and not all school budgets allow for enough on-site devices. Again, I've been talking a lot about games that are on like gaming system platforms, things that you would just basically hook to the TV and could probably show on an overhead in most classrooms. Well, if you're in a classroom where kids bring their own devices or it's encouraged to use a smartphone or a tablet, there's a lot of applications and games and things that you could use on there too that are maybe less mainstream than a Madden or a Zoo Tycoon, but I mean, they could be just as effective. But again, keep in mind, not everybody may have those. I mean, talking to some of my educator friends about this, and I'm like, well, what do you do if the kids don't have the money or the resources, or if maybe the family has the resources and don't feel like spending on a device? And my friend who works in Woodstock said, well, his problem is there's so many kids that get grounded and aren't allowed to take their aren't allowed to take their device to school or anywhere else for a few weeks, and then they aren't having it in his classroom where he expects them to. So I mean, there's some issues to consider there when you're planning ahead. So just, I guess, get a feel for what your students may or may not have, what they may or may not be used to, and plan accordingly. Closer look at potential changes. I'm going to blow this up a little bigger later when I'm not in PowerPoint mode, but just be mindful of the challenges we just talked about. Video game systems are common, but not in every home. Studies show that 65% of homes do have video game systems currently. That's from a study from 2016 when I first really started putting together this presentation, because that's when I was wrapping up the program at West Georgia that I talked about earlier. But nonetheless, keep in mind, 65%, that's a lot of people. That probably incorporates a lot of us, because like I said, I have a PS4 at home. But still, there's that 35%. Just as there's kids that may not have access to tablets and things, there's kids that may not have a video game system and may not, you know, they may be. It's one of those things where you don't want to leave anybody behind. You bring in video games, you pair people up, and you pair up three students that aren't used to the controller or the functions of a game, then you're going to have to slow down and help them, and that's going to probably make these students that are used to these things bored and frustrated with you. So again, there's a lot of planning you got to do and a lot of strategizing you got to do based on your students and their personalities and their interests and what they have access to. Video games aren't just for kids. I mentioned earlier that a lot of us are in the age range, that 18 to 41 age range, where we're actually statistically more likely to want to go out and buy the hot new game than a lot of kids are. So I still remember my older brother, who's 3 years older than me, us getting Super Mario Brothers 3 when it came out in the early 90s, because we both did really good on a report card the same, semester or quarter or whatever it was back then here in Floyd County, or in Floyd County, we're in Bartow. Goodness. In Floyd County, we did good in school and we got the video game, but now I guess you would just want your partner to get it for you for your birthday or something, because you're older and you're not getting a report card necessarily if you're wanting the hot new game. But anyhow, just as the games aren't necessarily for kids, keep in mind too, you may come across a game and find out it has adult content that maybe isn't appropriate for your age range. And also, some of the game may be hard. It may be made so that 30 and 40 something year old people put all their wits into it, you know. So be mindful of that when you're trying to find the right game for the right assignment. And I've got some statistics here that even show that smartphones aren't really everywhere. I mean, I keep going back to the 90s. Some of us remember Zach Morris on Saved by the Bell would have the big giant box phone, and people having those, which look really inconvenient now, and probably didn't really have that good a service anyway. But that was like a status symbol thing. That was like a big business thing, or a highfalutin kind of thing. But now, I mean, most everybody, it seems, at least has a little flip phone. But I mean, even smartphones aren't everywhere. So again, you got to the technology we think's everywhere isn't really everywhere. I mean, you may even have students that don't have the internet at home. It's easier to get to the internet than it is to get to an Xbox or a PlayStation product, I would say. But still, I mean, you just got to be mindful to not leave any students behind. With additional challenges, you have the concerned stockholders. I addressed this briefly when talking about Call of Duty and how questionable it was for me to even list it. But the stakeholders in this case would be pretty much anybody who has any kind of say or investment in what you're doing within the community you're working in. It could be the students, the parents, the people you work for, the people you work with, the newspaper, a lot of people, and you don't want to make a misstep and then be like, well, there you go. They're just bringing in video games, playing around, and not doing their jobs. Whereas I think it would be really big if you, as one of the first at your school perhaps, to really push this video game thing I'm big on, did a good job, and those people saw it and they're like, oh, okay, there's promise in this. We're not going to be critical when the next teacher comes through and tries this. Keep in mind also, and this is always important to me, and I imagine some of y'all's hearts are in the same place. Just keep in mind the students with disabilities. You may have students hard of hearing, students that can't see as well, students that may be hard for them to handle the controller for various reasons. I feel a really good solution for this would be the group activity. Group activities, now that you're in college here, you're probably already doing those. And trust me, because the deeper you get into this bachelor's degree you want, the more group activities you're going to do. And then when you're in grad school, that's going to be everything. There's going to be a lot of group activities. So think of it this way. If you have students K through 12, especially if they're middle school and above, and you're preparing them for that next step. That's part of your job. It's a big part of your job. You're preparing them, presumably for college, presumably, excuse me, presumably so they can come here, or presumably, another college or even a technical school. Not everybody's going to go to college. That next step may mean you're preparing them for the workforce. Either way, they're going to be doing group stuff. They're going to be doing group work at their job, or they're going to be doing group work at college. And I think a good way to prepare them for college, or that next step that you may not have thought of, would be do more group activities when you can. And a good way to open the door for more group activities would be to open the door for more technology, which would be a good way to open the door, get another door. It's like the opening of like Get Smart or Mystery Science Theater, where there's a door after door after door. That last door would be the students interacting with video games and you interacting with them. And one thing I could have listed too is, I mean, you may have other barriers like language. You may have English as a second language student. And I think, with somebody like that, or somebody with a learning disability, which is by no means comparable, but, if any student with any kind of challenge, I mean, once you're introducing new ways of learning, new ways of presenting things, and you're adding visuals, you're adding sound, you're adding things that would be different than just listening to me talk or somebody listening to you talk, then that could be a way to reach those students. Because I mean, you have different kind of learners. Some people learn from a lecture like this. Some people learn visually. Some people learn hands-on. And there's not that many things more hands-on than a video game. So that's another key point I should be driving home here, is that you can reach all kinds of learners with one simple video game. Okay, so now that's the end of our slideshow. If you have any questions, we're only about 20 some odd minutes into our presentation so far. So, and don't get too excited. We're not done. We're going to take as much time as they'll let us have. I think we got a good 45 minutes or so to work with. I am going to open the floor to questions. Any of you have. Uh, if there aren't enough questions, I have brought some materials and some examples from where I have integrated video games into classes. Uh, Many of them were here actually, and some of them were when I was getting my PhD at Auburn and had a lot of leeway as a teacher towards the end of that process as a professor there on the plains. But again, if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to just devote the rest of the time to that. If questions are minimal, I will give you some more time of training and thinking about this by showing you some real world examples. So I'm going to open the floor right quick for questions.